Thanks for joining us. This is The Economy. My name is Ibrahim Sani. In my office right now is a long-time friend of the show, ACCA member, and of course an ACCA senior policymaker of Asia Pacific, Sharath Martin. Sharath, thanks for taking the time to come over to the office to have a chat with us today. The idea here is that I want to talk more about ASEAN policy making, in fact Asia Pacific policy making at large, considering that the ASEAN summit is going to take place very soon. But before we go all into that, maybe you can share with us some of the other works that you do at ACCA as well as outside of ACCA.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you, Ibrahim, for having me. And to some extent, the kind of organizations that I'm part of as well, to perhaps provide some perspectives around some contemporary issues. So, yeah, I am a senior policy consultant with ACCA, covering the Asia Pacific remit. And I'm also on the board of trustees for two organizations. One is WWF in Malaysia, as well as SHIFT. Now, SHIFT is perhaps lesser known in these parts of the world, but they were the people who led the development of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which, as you know, is really a critical part of the S in ESG, as they say. But also, as you can imagine, there's interlinked dimensions of all of these aspects, from climate, nature, and people.
The idea here is, of course, trying to unravel the new world order, considering that US President Trump is redefining what it takes for them to, I guess, stake their place in the world, and how the countries around the world, especially those specifically in Southeast Asia, is reacting towards it. And the operative word is, of course, reacting. Seems like many of these ASEAN nations, as well as Asian nations for that matter, do not have a cohesive story and a cohesive plan to work in unison to address the new world order. How do you view policy making from the global south, so to speak, when it comes to dealing with countries and presidents like Trump and America?
Well, Ibrahim, you know, I actually might have a slightly different view about the strength of the global voice, the global South's voice, because I had the privilege of being at the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors meeting recently. And I think firstly, they had a very matured response to the whole, you know, sort of Trump dilemma, if I can call it that, because it was choosing not to just react, but rather to recognize that this is going to impact us significantly and that we would go to the negotiating table, but we would not just simply react by levying tariffs upon tariffs, right? So on top of that, I think if you kind of go back in time, and ASEAN has been a construct now in existence for 57 years. Initially, it came into existence to establish something that we now take for granted, but we actually shouldn't, which is peace. And I sometimes say to my friends, peace should be an active policy, not sort of an indirect consequence of whatever else that we do.
But I mean, yes, all in all, but on balance, but there's still Ukraine and Gaza right now. But I understand what you're trying to get at.
So I think in ASEAN we must be very careful about what we want to happen in our region. But going back to your point, I think about, you know, how is it that ASEAN can and should respond. This is where I think there needs to be more that ASEAN should start doing in terms of, shall I call it, a seat at the table of global policy making. So just to give you some context, right? I mean, if you look at some of the major sort of global bodies around, like World Bank and IMF, you know, they have 20 over executive directors in each of these organizations, and we only have about one person from ASEAN. That's one person. Now, again, what's the context of ASEAN? 670 million people. We've got 3.8 trillion in GDP, trade about the same number, 3.5 trillion. So, and then to top it off, we're going to have possibly a lot of people affected by climate and nature-related risks, right? As warming continues in its current trend. Now, on that basis, if we continue not to have a seat at the table, a stronger seat at the table, then how do we ensure that our interests are going to be not just protected, but in a sense elevated? Because that's what we need to do now. if I could go on,
Go on.
closer to home, in the accounting profession as well, we see some of this as well. Because if you take IFAC, which has got 180 professional accountancy organizations throughout the world, we again only have one person who comes from ASEAN. Now the whole world's abuzz about sustainability reporting.
Are you a member of IFAC? From ASEAN?
Professional accountancy
Oh,
organizations
sorry,
are,
okay.
right? And these, through the 180 professional accountancy organizations, there are millions of accountants, professional accountants, right? So let's remember that. Now, we talk about something that everyone's talking about, which is sustainability reporting now. And we have this construct called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which at this point has got no one from ASEAN, right? So I think, again, it comes back to the point, why and what should we start doing about some of these things? I also want to be very clear that, we're not trying to point criticisms against some of these bodies because they have done some good work in the past and they continue to do so. But the continued relevance is the question I'm asking. The continued relevance of these organizations, can ASEAN not be there? Shouldn't we have a stronger voice at the table? So that's where I think some of the perspectives I just wanted to put out.
When you talk about some of these international bodies, like for instance the International Sustainability Standards Board and the absence of a ASEAN voice at that body, they owe us no favor on being there. They don't. It is actually more of ASEAN trying to impose our presence at these international bodies in order for us to better shape policies with regard to global impact. I don't hold it against them. I'm more of, are we doing enough, ASEAN members, in imposing ourselves at the global stage? Why is now the time to step onto the global stage and impose our values, our cultures, and our viewpoints to these international bodies?
Okay, so I want to address that point about values a bit later, but I just want to go back to now your sustainability standards. Now, in ASEAN, we've got 10 markets. Now, if we count them in terms of GDP, 85% of ASEAN economies in terms of GDP have already or are planning to introduce these International Sustainability Standards Boards standards into their legal and regulatory framework. Now, I don't know of many other regional blocs which have got this strong push and advocating for this. But again, I would say at the AFM-GM meeting that I referenced earlier, we made a number of points. One is, if you compare sustainability standards and reporting with financial reporting, in financial reporting we only have one standard, one global standard, Ibrahim. But in sustainability standard, an ASEAN business would conceivably have to report twice. One on ISSB and another one on Europe if we are going to be part of a European supply chain. Now that's quite an onerous obligation.
Yeah.
In the same way, Europe is also kind of backpedaling because now in the ESRS, as they call it, there's this omnibus directive which they're looking to simplify the burden of reporting and a whole bunch of other things on SMEs. So again, we are kind of asking for the same thing. And what we are saying is, why don't we just have one global standard? And until such time as we have one global standard, like we do with financial reporting, there needs to be some transition relief, right? So I think that's the reason why we need to start speaking up, Ibrahim, because otherwise our businesses are going to be impacted. Yeah.
No, you're right. That much I agree. And but then there is a question of over-dependence towards external capital infrastructure as well. Do you feel that that over-dependence and over-reliance is going to exacerbate in the years to come if we don't do anything today?
100%, I think. The question is, and this is a question I get quite a bit, is then where do we find the money that we need, right? And I can take this from a number of angles. For example, we in Asia Pacific, now let me just pivot from ASEAN to Asia Pacific, more than half of the economic value add in Asia Pacific is either moderately or highly dependent on nature, right? But the question should be asked, then what do we do to invest back in nature? And who should do it? But the prevailing notion is nature is free and we have not really invested in it. Neither we nor the advanced nations that rely on value chains coming out of Asia. So coming back to your point, now who's going to invest in it? And my view is, well, if we don't, because this is our home, then who will? And nature is so intrinsically linked with warming temperatures, right? So you imagine we've got the third largest labor force in ASEAN, around the world in ASEAN. The heat stress that is going on, the real question businesses should be asking is now, how are my people impacted by this? What loss of productivity am I already facing and am I likely to face going forward? This is so real that I think this is possibly going to become a healthcare issue that we need to have a handle on in time to come. So, you know, I think there are so many aspects to this. Do you feel that there are
concrete steps or at least clear steps to take for Asia to unlock human capital access or financial access to fund sustainable, inclusive growth in order for us to, I guess, negate the overdependence element here?
That's the real challenge, because if you think about the cumulative investments that are needed to keep, say,
private
warming,
wealth, I guess, maybe, not just institutions.
I think that there almost is a need to rethink the whole financial model and the infrastructure, because bear in mind, we've lived with some of this infrastructure, financial infrastructure, for such a long time. Now, the dollar exchange rate, the floating exchange rate as we know it, was conceptualized in the year that I was born, right? And
which is what? How old are you?
Which is 1971.
1994 maybe, no?
No, 1971. And so we only have an institutional memory which tells us this is all we know. But I'd like to think that, look, if we go back longer in history, we should be able to uncover ideas which also tell us that we can develop other models. This model is not permanent, and perhaps there needs to be a newer model. Now, again, some of my colleagues ask me the question, then what is the alternative model? And I'll be very honest with you, Ibrahim. I'm not the smartest kid on the block. There will be other people who come in who need to address this issue.
We're accountants. We're not the smartest kid.
Yeah, but I think we see the flow. And from the flow, we can identify that we're going to have a problem here.
Do you think that there are some practical steps that policymakers, or at least people who work with these policymakers, can take to implement these kind of corrective measures if they are listening in or if they are watching us right now? What is ACCA doing right now or thinking about when it comes to making the situation a little bit better than it currently is?
I think one is simply the act of speaking up on some of these issues. And we do it on the back of research, you know, not just some, back of an envelope type of thing. We do it on the back of surveys, on the back of roundtables, on the back of interviews with experts, and then we share. And our research is, it's out there in the public domain. But then the important bit is not to let those reports stay on some website and no one talks about it. The important bit is then to bring out these issues again and again and again into the public domain. And I think it was, to some extent, it was nothing better than the opportunity to speak at that ASEAN forum and to address those points. Again, one, why don't we now speak as one collective voice? It is so important that ASEAN needs to learn how to speak as a collective voice and to use, what I think our children would call flex. Right? We need to flex. Why is it that we can flex? Because we are such a major contributor to the global value chain.
Of course, then there is a risk of flexing in an echo chamber. Not to say that forums like the upcoming Malaysian Institute of Accountants conference or similar conferences at the ASEAN, if not the Asia Pacific stages. It's also important for us to talk about these items outside of our comfort zone and outside of the remit that we normally have. Do you feel that that is not just a necessity but an urgency for us to do so?
Absolutely. Again, because the context is always so relevant. We got 670 million people. Our biodiversity contribution to the world in terms of aquaculture, in terms of marine life is so critical that we are the ones who will be disproportionately affected. And to go back to your earlier question, with what investment? Not a lot. We need 1.5 trillion. We only have about 5.2 billion invested in some of these projects. That's a huge gap. Now the question is, now what do we do about these things, and what is the collective efforts that we need to raise around this? And I think part of this is now ASEAN needs to learn that while we have worked quite well in the ASEAN construct, to some extent we've always also been quite individual market based.
Yeah.
And to some extent I also feel, Ibrahim, long may it be so that we do not go down an European Union type of model where there's monetary and economy, because then it becomes very difficult to untangle issues. I think
I'm for a single market economy, Sharath.
Yeah.
I feel that there are a lot more gains for economies and markets like Southeast Asia to work together collectively and not untangle each other, because I think getting closer to each other makes us wrapped up in our own fate, and I think that would force markets that are slower than us and markets that are faster than us to walk together in a common denominator notion. Singapore can't run any more than they can right now. They've saturated their market. The country is so expensive. The democracy is, as we know, is like that. And then of course you have burgeoning democracies like Indonesia and Vietnam that we don't know what they're going to end up with. And then you have markets like Myanmar.
I would not disagree entirely, in the sense that I think we need a more market-based approach, but I would stop from all these notions of a ASEAN Parliament, for example, right?
Okay.
Or even the need for a common currency.
Actually, that much I agree.
Yeah. So I think we need to be careful about
what kind of model, right?
This is the point also, Ibrahim. Do we always need to copy someone else's model? Why can't ASEAN come up with its own model? And to some extent, I would say this. I think our ministers and prime ministers and leaders have actually done a fairly good job in taking us to a certain stage today. But we also need to recognize that now, and this goes back, why now? Because now we've got 670 million people on our back. And we've got a large youth segment. We've got technology which is like a tailwind. Amazing adoption in ASEAN relative to many other markets. But at the same time, we also have issues about our currency. We also have issues about the whole climate and nature thing that I spoke about.
For the viewers, they might not be familiar with Sharath's work. Sharath, you're into public policy, you're into finance, you're into sustainability. But one element that I want to explore moving forward for the next 5-10 minutes of this interview is on human capital development and talent management. ACCA is perhaps the world's most recognized brand when it comes to professional accounting. Here at Yayasan Penaju, as well as Kementerian Ekonomi or the Ministry of Economy, we take pride in the work that we do in trying to bring up the best in terms of youth talent development and making them professionally certified accountants at an early age through our fast track program. That's one element. At the same time, under the same breath, we tell them, don't be an accountant for the rest of your life. This is I don't know whether this is countermeasure or oxymoron, but that's exactly what we tell them. Be chartered, work 3 years in your firm, and after 24, 25 years old, now if you want to be an accountant for the rest of your life, by all means, go for it. But now that you are equipped with the status of a chartered membership, either ACCA or ICAW, or for those young graduate and go for CP Australia or SEMA or whatever you have, MICPA CANS, use that to build something for the nation, to build something for yourself. Now, we all know that with the advent of disruption in the form of AI and other digital transformation disruption, it doesn't take away the jobs that is needed for the future. It just needs redefining into what kind of jobs that we need for the future. horse carriage drivers are now obsolete, but we have cab drivers. Now, cab drivers they might be obsolete. What we have next? People still need work, and with the advent of technology, people still need to redefine what they need to build for the future. Considering this is the situation that we have right now, and with partners like ACCA or ASEAN Praju, and of course working together with how the global stage is needed, what we've been discussing for the past 20 minutes, how do you see talent management and human capital development is going to be shaped forward to address these very problems that we've been discussing?
Ibrahim, you said 5-10 minutes. This is something I could go on for
5-10 minutes.
1.5 days. But look, I think let's address a few things. Firstly, what you just talked about, which is beginning to take up an accountancy qualification really sets you up for the diversity of career ranges that one can have. I myself I happen to be an ACCA member myself, and I've gone through a career ranging from being an auditor to being head of risk to being in the regulator space, and now I'm in research. And like you're also now.
Yeah, it's strange, right? I was an investment banker, I was a radio broadcaster, I was a TV presenter, and now I'm running an agency. It's
and we are not alone to some extent. There are many of us like this who have got a whole different range of experiences, which I think is something interesting that I don't think is just a coincidence that accountancy sets you up for this.
It's
right?
not.
The training, the competencies that it teaches you, the sort of technical depth, and then that business sort of breadth that it gives you.
Yeah.
I might be sounding like I'm preaching to the converted here, but I think that's a distinct advantage. But having said that, once you're in the door, then you just got to perform, right? And that's where you have the chaff separated from the wheat. But look, that should be the case for anything else. Now, coming back to this ecosystem that we are part of, I'm absolutely proud of the fact that in Malaysia, we produce world prize winners in an examination as tough as ACCA, time after time, quarter after quarter. And I don't say this with, I'm gloating here. I'm talking about Malaysian talent. But I also feel for them, Ibrahim, because then they come out, they get paid in ringgit, what is the equivalent of maybe $800, right? And this is, you just said, chartered accountancy, qualification. Wow, amazing
and
thing.
all the pain and suffering and emotional turmoil that one has to go through.
Right.
800 US.
Yeah.
Betul lah tu.
And so, of course, this also gives rise to global
Current
business
market
services,
rate prevailing, yes.
Right. Which is another business opportunity that our friends like. But okay, let's.
No, but then there's the ever perennial problem of brain drain and the like. Yeah.
You see, so can we fix this without fixing the currency issue?
No.
I don't think so, right? But I think it's too early to talk about what will be the alternatives to the dollar. But I think there are enough, sort of stakeholders affected by this. The better minds, the smarter minds phrase that we talked about, who need to start looking into this issue. But it really affects us as ASEAN, because despite the talent that we produce, which is, shall we call it, world class, we then get paid, shall I call the word, depressed incomes, wages. And it's not a phenomenon just unique to Malaysia.
Yeah, how is it like in the countries that you're looking at?
Well, I think throughout ASEAN, it's pretty much the same scenario. Now, you talked about values earlier, which is why I want to kind of bring this up.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
So, in the work that I do also on the subject of human rights, I have kind of taken pains to mention that, there's a lot of, shall we call it, criticism levied against Asia and parts of Asia for the way we treat our labor, forced labor, child labor, all kinds of instances and often allegations. But I want to ask the question, do we have different values in how we treat humans in Asia compared to advanced the global north? And my answer is I don't think we do. We both love our children the same, we both love our children. the way we love them will be different from how someone else loves them. That doesn't mean that at a fundamental value, we are different. We are the same.
But it does also mean that one is imposing their values upon another.
Where I'm coming from is this. So if then we ask ourselves, why is it that we pay our people so low? I'll give you an example, right? When the government wanted to introduce this 2% EPF contribution for foreign workers, people were going up in arms.
Not people, MEF.
Right?
Right now, the ex-governor of Bank Negara governor is saying that, you know, fresh grads should be paying 8,000. MEF responded by saying anything more than 5,000 is detrimental to businesses.
Yeah. So I'll tell you something. So because we did a piece of research on living wage, right? Living wage is not a commonly understood term, so I'll just explain it as the wage level that you need to have a decent standard of living. Not a super duper flying everywhere, a decent standard of living. Yeah, but coming back to this, you know, in Asia or ASEAN, we kind of grew our economies to some extent by being the offshore centers of manufacturing, production, and all kinds of other things, your global business services as well. Now, we took that business really on the basis of our cost model. Our resources were cheap and our people were cheap. Can that be our value proposition going forward? Are we going to stand, let's say we are policy makers on some of these governments, can we stand there and say, well, our economic growth is going to be predicated and premised on one thing, that our people are cheap? No.
No.
Right? So we need to start weaning ourselves, but anyone who's in a low-cost model will know it's very hard to wean yourself off this. Why do I raise this? I'll give you an anecdotal example. Because garment manufacturing in Bangladesh is a big thing.
Yeah, of course.
So they want, the CFO of a company we spoke to wanted to raise wages. And so they had conversations with the fashion house brands in the global north about the need to improve wages to their people.
Pushback lah.
And what was the pushback though, Ibrahim? The pushback is our consumers could not afford it.
Yeah. Their domestic market in the global north.
Imagine that. But so because of that, wages will be kept depressed.
And for the foreseeable future.
In working in conditions which are, you know, really questionable.
Squalor.
So we, I think as ASEAN governments, on behalf of our peoples, have to start taking a different view of how our economies are going to be brought up to the next stage of development and how our people are going to be part of that value chain.
Basically, we need to have a unified voice in the global south on how to restructure our economy and stand on our own 2 feet.
Yep, and can we extend that to maybe Asia Pacific, right?
Yeah, of course.
Because if you take China, when China tried to lift it, then it was other markets which started to try and source that work on a cheaper basis.
Of course.
I won't name them, right? But you probably know who they are. I think the same could happen also here because we have so many countries at different levels of maturity. So we need a stronger framework than just intent. We have to start thinking, okay, now understand that if you go through this model, eventually your people are going to suffer.
Yeah.
We just don't need to go far. Just look at our EPF statistics, and it will tell you what the median wage is of what we got 16 million workers. Half of them are active. Out of that 8 million, this is it in the year 2025.
And then the number gets more dire if you look at LHDN numbers or inland revenue numbers.
Right.
How many percentage of the workers are actually paying taxes?
Yeah.
So I just paid my tax last week, so it's
and you know, it is actually horrible that people are in the top 10 quartile or whatever you want to call it, even though the incomes are so low. You know, it's sort of saying something about the societies in which we are basing our livelihoods in. So I think, you know, we can't unpack any of what we have talked about without looking at human capital.
Thank you very much, Sharath. That was Sharath Martin, the Senior Policy Consultant at ACCA Asia Pacific. I would highly recommend you to look at ACCA's research on public policy, on public finance as well as talent development. And of course, if you want to watch more of these kind of interviews, just head on to Astro AWANI and search for The Economy or search my name, Ibrahim Sani. There's plenty of discussions like this there. Catch you in the next one.